Hello and welcome to Global Voices Insights. Whether you're watching our live stream or tuning in later on, we are glad to have you with us. My name is Ellery Roberts-Biddle. I am the former AdVox Director, Global Voices, and now an editor with Coda Story. So in today's edition, we're going to talk about democracy because whether it feels like it or not, today is, in fact, International Democracy Day. So we're tackling a big question that has loomed before us for some time now. Can citizens of democracies still trust the law? We're going to focus our discussion on laws that govern digital spaces. Since the early 2000s, governments around the world have been developing and adopting legislation directed at the internet and other kinds of networked technologies. But too often, laws that sound like they'll serve the public interest, cybersecurity laws are a good example, are then passed and used to stifle rather than protect people's rights in digital space. So here to discuss this with us today, we have three esteemed members of the team behind Global Voices Unfreedom Monitor, a research and reporting project looking at how technology is being used to advance authoritarian governance around the world. And these panelists are all seeing these dynamics firsthand in their home countries and studying their effects as part of the Unfreedom Monitor project. Joining us from Brazil is Laís Martins, a Brazilian journalist, researcher, and 2021 Pulitzer Center Fellow. Joining us from India, we have Alok Prasanna Kumar, legal expert and co-founder of the VD Center for Legal Policy. And from Hungary, my dear friend Vesna Vesnauer, legal expert and program manager at Ranking Digital Rights. My name again is Ellery Roberts-Biddle, and I'm speaking to you from Philadelphia in the US. And to everybody watching in our live stream, as we get the conversation going, we invite you to pose questions to our panelists in the YouTube comments section. We'll be monitoring that space. So before we dive in for a little bit of global context on this issue, I looked back at Freedom House's 2021 Freedom on the Net report. And this is an annual report that this research organization produces that gives a comprehensive evaluation of key rights and freedoms online in dozens of countries around the world. The report was pretty grim. They found that global internet freedom had declined for the 11th consecutive year, that more governments arrested users for nonviolent political, social, or religious speech than ever before, and that authorities in at least 48 countries pursued new rules for tech companies on content, data, and competition. And Adrian Shabazz and Ali Funk wrote that with a few positive exceptions, these laws were pushing to regulate the industry in a way that was being exploited to subdue free expression and gain greater access to people's private data. So we can't possibly talk about all of these examples today, but we are going to look at three key countries, democracies, I think, in different regions of the world, where ruling governments are pushing and sometimes crossing the boundaries of democratic norms and institutions, like elections and media freedom. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us one example, tell us about a law that is either in force or in draft that seems to fall into this category. And I'd like to begin in Brazil. Laís, can you tell us about this highly anticipated so-called fake news bill? And it would help if you could describe it within Brazil's current political climate. Disinformation was a serious problem in the 2018 election. How did that help shape the bill that deputies will be voting on in the coming term?
Great. Thank you, Ellery. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone, and I think key countries, and we all have so many similarities to discuss today. So I'll talk about the fake news bill, and ironically enough, I love talking about Jair Bolsonaro and everything his government has done in Brazil, but today we'll be focusing on Congress because the fake news bill is something coming from Congress. Before I head into what the bill itself entails, I'd like to explain a bit about the context and what led to this bill. So as you said, 2018 in Brazil was the social media election, right? I think it was the first time that we really saw social media kick in and candidates really use their power on social media to achieve new voters and even to strengthen their supporter bases. And Jair Bolsonaro was the social media candidate, right? He was very skillful in using social media to his advantage, and that kind of went into his presidency, as did disinformation and fake news. And later on, we started seeing things like coordinated influence campaigns and smear campaigns and harassment on social media against political, either the opposition or activists or even journalists. So when 2020 comes, and that's when the fake news bill starts moving in Congress, we have local elections, right? So municipal elections. And there is this idea that we cannot head into another electoral process without legislation that covers this area of fake news and specifically fake news. That was the idea. So deputies in Congress, this was started by the left, mostly in Congress, in the Chamber of Deputies, start putting this project out, which initially starts with the aim of fighting fake news, which is huge already, right? So like, how do you actually put that into one bill? And as it moves forward, they understand that they won't be able to approve it alone, the left. So it has to become something that is either appealing to the right and the right, by then it was mostly candidates aligned to Jair Bolsonaro, President Jair Bolsonaro. So they start incorporating, as the debate process moves on in the Chamber of Deputies, they start incorporating suggestions from different fields and also from academia and civil society, who outside of Congress are alerting about the impacts that legislating around such a topic might have to individual freedoms and overall to the environment of media freedom and freedom of expression in Brazil. I'm sorry. And then what initially began as this bill to fight fake news becomes a huge platform regulation bill, huge. I think bigger than what we have that have moved forward in some other countries. So even actors who at the beginning were very committed to this bill, they start backing down and saying like, look, this has become way too huge. I think we have to take it easier. Like we have to discuss it in more detail, because what we're aiming to change here is how the internet works in Brazil and how platforms operate in Brazil. So the current version of the bill, and I say the current because it has changed so much in these 2 years, it has 5 main points, and I'll go over them very quickly. So the first is that it establishes basic rules for content moderation by platforms. So what can they do, what can they not do, and when? It sets stricter transparency requirements for platforms. This is a huge problem in Brazil. We have very little information on how platforms operate in Brazil, their numbers and everything, because they just report global numbers. So we're kind of in the dark. It also establishes mechanisms to investigate encrypted messages. So thinking of how WhatsApp is so huge in Brazil, right? It's in 99% of Brazilians' phones. This was something that came up in these last years. How can we use these messages to investigate, and how can we access these messages? It also creates a set of specific rules for people in public office. And the idea here is to draw a hard line between their private lives or their private figures online and who they are online as their public figures, as politicians or even the president. Then it also establishes a kind of regulated auto-regulation, which is let platforms regulate themselves, an idea, but have an authority to oversee their regulation. And this would be either a political authority or a newly created authority comprised of civil society, academia, kind of a mix of many actors. And lastly, a point that was kind of a detail in there, but later on I'll explain because it is so important, is that it would require platforms to pay for journalistic content, kind of like what happened in Australia. And what happened with this bill? So in April, it was in the floor of the Chamber of Deputies, and they were voting an urgency requirement, which would fast track the bill. So that would kind of jump some phases. So that would enable this bill to potentially be in place by the time elections come. We are 20 days out of our first round of elections. So there was kind of consensus around actors in Congress that it was important to have this in place by elections. Even between right-wing politicians and left-wing, I think there was a general interest that we needed something that regulates fake news by the time elections come. What happened in the end was it was rejected by very few votes. So they could not approve the urgency by very few votes. And it was a last minute thing that, you know, those votes that changed in the last minute because there were lobbyists on the floor. Big tech, people representing big tech on the floor of the vote, changing representatives' votes last minute. And they, of course, big tech companies did not want this regulation because it would, the transparency thing was bad for them. Later on, I'll speak why they didn't want. But the thing is, they were able to change these votes last minute. So in the end, this did not pass by very few votes. And of course, pro-Bolsonaro actors also were not interested in having that in place. So the feeling is, and it's kind of a general feeling, the feeling is of a missed opportunity, right? So we missed the opportunity of having a legislation that could regulate fake news, but also there's an understanding that this is such a huge area that it cannot be done in any way, like just for the sake of having a bill in place. So that's kind of the context. I think, yeah, later on I'll speak to the role of big tech in this process and what happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Lace. And I guess if you don't mind, I just wanted to sort of try to pull out a little bit more there in our some exchange that we had leading up to today's discussion. You talked about the fact that, and this is just on the part of the bill that looks at content, you said that it criminalizes content instead of behavior. And I wanted to ask if you could just tell us, you know, I understand that this is moving, and so it might, what it appears in the language now might not actually become the law. But if what we see right now were to become law, how would it affect people's abilities to express themselves, exchange ideas in digital spaces? And I'm really curious about that content versus behavior distinction that you drew.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because, well, in Brazil, I work as a journalist for Núcleo Jornalismo, which is an outlet covering platform policies and just this intersection between platforms and politicians and politics. And we covered this bill throughout its process, and speaking to many people who are thinking of content moderation, also looking at examples from other countries, this came up very frequently, right? It's wrong to try to moderate content and criminalize content, and we should be focusing on behavior. Because if we focus on content, we pave the way for political abuse. So who is deciding what content is illegal or not, right? Or what content violates rules, like rules that are to be set by this bill? Who are we giving this authority to? Because currently it's a right-wing government who has shown that they have little respect for individual freedoms. They tend to be more on the side of extremism. So it's not ideal to have political authorities deciding on what content is in or out. So by focusing on behavior, we can think of networked operations and harassment campaigns that are coordinated against political figures. And the problem of the bill was that not only it focused on content, but it also granted a waiver to politicians, right? There was a paragraph that was, it was a very big problem, a very alarming paragraph, which was called parliamentary immunity, which was kind of a waiver that, look at all these rules, they don't apply for politicians because in the exercise of their public roles, they're not subject to the same set of rules as us citizens. So then it would be an unequal burden on citizens, and those who should also be who the law should also apply to, because currently in Brazil we're seeing politicians abuse their social media audiences, and they use it to incite violence and to incite and to promote doubts about the electoral process. So these people should also be subject to the same set of rules, right? And overall, the idea of deciding on content, it's very tricky, it's very subjective, right? And then when we also think that platforms are not really aware of contextual issues in Brazil, in India, this is also a problem. We don't want people who are not really aware of the country to be deciding on what content is allowed to be there or not. So yeah, but it's a very tricky discussion. Like over the time, I was always thinking like, oh my God, there's no easy solution for this issue, right? So yeah, but I hope I replied to your question. You're muted.
Thanks. I think that sets us up really well to move to India and ask Alok to jump into the conversation. And we are eager to hear from you about the IT Act, which is sort of a famous censorship tool at this point and covers a lot of ground. I wonder if you could tell us about these a couple of different sections that have been especially powerful, controversial, and perhaps not legal.
Thanks, Ezari. And I was listening to Lais and thinking, yeah, actually, that's a lot of commonalities I hear there. But I want to make two initial points before I come specifically to the IT Act. Uh, let's in a country with fairly weak rule of law, you don't need to take down content. You just go after the person who creates the content. That works just as well. So in a sense, you don't need to delete, you don't need to censor, you don't need to block. You just need to throw that person in jail and they will learn their lesson. The second thing is that this ability to have consequences offline is only realistically possible if the police and the judiciary don't work independently. And by independently, I mean they see their jobs as to do what the political authorities are telling them to do so. And I use this term advisedly because I'm not a fan of linking to any one particular government. Over the last 2-3 decades or so, if India has gotten to the stage of democracy that it has, it's been because successive governments have steadily eroded democracy in different ways. Each one has found a different way to build on the previous one's erosion, if I have to mix a few metaphors. So, in a sense, we have a weakened rule of law where the police and the judiciary don't follow the law so much as the instructions or the soft signals which comes from the government. Keeping that in mind, we have to understand the Information Technology Act. The Information Technology Act comes at a time, initially it came in 2000, which was the time that the internet was still a very niche thing in India. It was hardly mainstream. It gets amended quite dramatically in 2009 when when the internet is starting to go mainstream. But its worst problems really start to come up when the internet in India becomes very widespread, which is a few years after that. So I want to specifically talk about two sections. One which I like to call a zombie section, and you'll see why. And the other is the section which is actually used to block content. Now, Section 66 capital A, which is what was introduced in 2009, says actually this, and I'm reading it out only to make the absurdity of this section possible. Punishment for sending offensive messages through communication service. Any person who sends by means of a computer resource or a communication device any information that is grossly offensive or has menacing character shall be punishable with imprisonment for a term which may extend to 3 years and a fine. Okay, keep in mind those words: grossly offensive or a menacing character. Right now, are these as and this struck me when Lais was mentioning it. Here is a straight up policing of content. It is not behavior. There is no way you can define objectively what is grossly offensive or menacing. We saw a period of time when literally anyone who had a problem with something that someone said on the internet, right? If you have access to resources, if you know the local cops, you could get people thrown into jail for just something you did not like. Forget about criminality, right? This made anything that is unacceptable criminal. Now, obviously, a few instances became public knowledge. People were upset and outraged, and one law student approached court, so which resulted in the judgment that is known as Shreya Singhal versus Union of India. Uh, it challenged not only this particular section of law, Section 66 capital A, but another section which still survives on the books, which is called Section 69 capital A. Section 69 capital A allows the government to block certain content on the internet. It can ask a Google or a Twitter or whoever it is to block certain content on the internet on certain specific grounds. I'll come to Section 69 capital in a little bit because it's still being used. But 66A, I think, illustrates something that is what is fundamentally broken in India's system. 66 capital A, the case was argued. There's an excellent judgment of the Supreme Court of India, which says this goes against the constitutional guarantee of freedom of speech and expression. And in 2015, the court struck it down. Right, the court said this is unconstitutional. It should not be enforced anymore, and it's against India's fundamental constitutional freedom of speech. And everybody was yes, good judgment, great. Except for 7 years after this judgment, this particular section continues to be used. Even the other day, a week or so ago, the Supreme Court was hearing petitions from people who were saying, this judgment which you delivered is being ignored on the ground. Police are continuing to apply it. People are still being jailed on the uh, provisions of this act. Now, it may not be the union government because the union government is not present across the country. It may be the state government or the regional governments, but people are still being punished for this section which you have struck down. The absurd and bizarre thing is, Section 66A was on the statute books from 2009 to 2015. That's 6 years. It has been dead since 2015, but it has been used for the subsequent 7 years. So it's been a zombie section much longer than it was actually ever alive and being used. But here we have it, right? We have a section of law which on paper has been struck down, but on the ground, given the state of rule of law in India, continues to be used to stifle speech. But that's only one section. The other section that I want to point out is Section 69 capital A, which is still on the statute books. Now, Section 69 capital A, which allows the government to block certain kinds of content on the internet, continues to remain on the statute books. And in the same judgment, the Supreme Court said this particular provision of the law is actually constitutional because it allows the government to take action in accordance with the grounds laid down in the Constitution. Unfortunately, what the court kind of missed was that the procedure for blocking content was not fair or transparent. The government could today, not I hope it doesn't happen, but the government could literally send a notice to YouTube saying take down today's live stream of Global Voices because this Alok Prasanna Kumar fellow is saying all sorts of bad things about us, and they could take it down. Our stream will stop, and nobody will know why until one of us chases YouTube to find out why did you take it down. Then YouTube might say, yeah, we received an order from the government. We'll ask them for a copy of the order. They'll say there is no such copy because we were told not to disclose it. We'll have to run to the government. There's essentially it's a very Kafkaesque kind of provision. It can be taken down without you knowing it, without having any idea why or what you did wrong, what you said wrong, what is the consequence. But unfortunately, the court upheld it, and this has become the default way of taking down a lot of content. Now, something Lies mentioned also struck a chord because a lot of recent takedowns have been of YouTube channels. I'm not talking about individual videos. Entire channels have been taken down on YouTube, but not in the sense that they're no longer visible in India, at least, because the government insists that they're spreading fake narratives, anti India narratives, false stories, or whatever. Now, in some senses, some of these are based outside India, so it is possible that these channels may, in fact, be part of some misinformation campaign. but a lot of others were covering on the ground events which perhaps the mainstream media was not covering. And these channels were an important source of information in a lot of local events which maybe the mainstream media would not cover, and they had a huge following. But they have been taken down, and they have no remedy under the law because they don't know why they have been taken down. They don't know what they did wrong. They don't know what is their remedy, and they did not receive any notice. So there is a complete failure in this process. It's a law which essentially allows the government to act as unlawfully as possible. Sounds like a little bit of a contradiction, but essentially something like Section 69A fits into a larger stream of laws in India, which are what I like to call lawless laws. They empower the government or people in government to act with complete discretion, with no stability, with no certainty. They don't create a clear procedure for you to be able to redress if the government has taken a wrong action, and they have vast consequences on the rights of individuals. So we want up to tie the two or three threads that I've talked about together. We have a situation in India where there are offline consequences for online speeches and online speech, and also online speech itself is being censored in many different ways, and in a manner which does not seem to allow for any redress or any action on the part of an individual to be able to show why they are not violating the law.
Thank you, Alok. And that this raises some really important questions, I think, about the role of private companies that effectively do decide what kinds of material we actually see and what we can say online. And we're going to move to that pretty soon. But let's first hear from Vesna. Vesna, you shared with us a little bit about one law that criminalizes the distribution of LGBTQ content under the guise of child protection. You also explained to us that this law has been pushed through in a state of emergency. And I wanted to ask if you could tell us about it within that, again, the broader political context.
Sure.
Yes.
I think I want to go back a little bit more in time to 2015. Actually, that's when the refugee crisis started in Europe and in Hungary as well, and that's when the popularity of Fidesz started to fall. So they really used the crisis as a tool to gain back popularity and exploited it for their own purposes, and basically made refugees as the number one enemies in Hungary. A group of people who Hungary needs to be protected from. And since then, this has been really a tendency and a tactic of Fidesz to pick a group of, usually a vulnerable group, or the opposition, or the NGOs funded by George Soros as the enemies of the nation, and say that Fidesz will protect Hungarians from them. And I remember in 2015, when I was working for a think tank in Hungary, that we were already saying that if they can do this with refugees, we can expect this to happen to LGBTQI people as well. And this is what we see today, actually. So last year, I think it was last year, or maybe this year, sorry, that was when the government enacted and adopted a law which they call a child protection law. And it is, I think, a really good example, because the government is saying that this law is really there to protect children and to basically introduce measures that will make sure that Hungarian children are protected from pedophiles. And I think that is kind of the most problematic parts, because it is an attempt to conflate pedophiles with LGBTQI people. So the law has several sections, and most of them are about banning content from books, from TVs, and therefore from online broadcasting platforms as well, that display any kind of LGBT content, and this should be the case for under 18s. And that means that if you publish something in a book, you also have to go through this filter. So that is the offline part. But I think it wasn't necessarily the main intention to have an effect on the online information environment. But what we see now is that it is very similar to what we see in Saudi Arabia, actually, that the government, or like the authority that is supposed to be monitoring and enforcing this law, is doing an investigation to Netflix and one of its program. It is actually a cartoon, I think, where there are two girls who fall in love and then they kiss each other. So they want it to be banned in Hungary for the reasons I mentioned. And I think what Ellery was saying is that all this is happening in an environment that has been going on since the pandemic, because in Hungary, the state of emergency resulted in a rule of decree by the government, and there is no sunset clause to that. So we don't know when it is going to be ended. But the thing is that even if there wasn't a state of emergency, the Hungarian government, Fidesz-led government, this year gained two-thirds majority again during the elections. They've been in power since 2010. And so they can change the constitution and they can adopt laws without any problem. They don't need the opposition. What I think is also like worth to mention in relation to this law is that they also it also bans any kind of solidarity campaigning or advertising by companies. So, for instance, before this law was enacted, Coca-Cola in Hungary during the Pride months did some advertising online around the Pride and in solidarity with the LGBTQI community, and Fidesz politicians were condemning it very loudly. So I think this is also like that had led the government to this. And so at the moment, we've seen already that books have been pushed back, and there's been like criticism on what can be published in certain books. And what we also see is that they try to limit who can go to schools and talk about sexual education. So there is a list of organizations who are allowed to do that, but LGBTQI organizations are not allowed to do that anymore. I think I'm gonna pause here and see if there are follow-up questions.
That's upsetting and a really sort of given us a great window into another really complex picture. I'm actually wondering, because I sort of see Alok and Lais kind of nodding as you're speaking, if there's anything that came up for either of you here that you'd want to kind of point out, because although we're looking at three really different contexts, there are some interesting parallels, let's say.
Yeah. Sorry,
oh, yeah.
my alarm is going off, but it's stopping very soon. No, I was nodding at the end because this hits so close to home, this part about like defining who is allowed to talk to children about sexual education and even about LGBTQI rights. This idea of moral values and the Christian family. This is very strong in Jair Bolsonaro's presidency, but it doesn't really reflect on social media. So I think it's that's kind of where we draw a line between where Hungary is and where Brazil is. But it's kind of, the playbook is the same. They're going by the same rules, right? So this idea that, we cannot talk about LGBTQI because that encourages people to come out as LGBTQI, or the intersection between pedophiles and LGBTQI. This appears here in Brazil too. So it's very upsetting to see that even so far away, they are making bridges and things are just connecting in this horrible way.
Look.
Yeah, moving beyond, or at least going one step further from what Vesna said, I think it was, for me, what really struck was the fact that the government chooses new enemies. And I use that term relying on the German philosopher Carl Schmitt, who was known as the Nazi philosopher. And he sort of makes the point that a state really can only exist if it keeps identifying enemies. That's why he was so liked by the Nazis. And it's unfortunately a very influential book, because influential set of writings, because a lot of people sort of see it that way, that you can only claim popular sovereignty if you can identify an enemy that you can unite everyone behind. And I think in India, the present regime has sort of identified largely two categories, which is Muslims and Christians. The former much more than the latter, and if and it happens not necessarily at the national level, but also at the local and the regional levels. Occasionally, it is the Chinese, or occasionally it is Western values, and there's a small overlap between Western values and LGBT. But I will say in India, it's still at a very nascent stage, the whole debate and discussion, and perhaps it may go in a very different direction, LGBT rights and so on. So I'll leave that aside for the moment. But I think the larger point, and this is where the flip side of regulation of the internet is, to be able to use the internet to target the enemies, right? You may legally not necessarily target them in a particular way, although there are specific laws which do that, but you mobilize the powers of the state to try and erase, Muslim culture or Christian references of people belonging to these religions from popular culture, from mainstream discourse, from political representation. So to that extent, I sort of see this particular parallel where you are defining that India is only for Hindus. And I suppose in some similar way, in Hungary it might be, or in Brazil for that matter, Hungary or Brazil is only for Christians, or white Christians, or whatever that is. So I sort of see how, in some senses, this is old, but it is taking new dimensions with the kind of control that the government exercises, or is able to use the internet and social media for.
Vesna.
I think, yes. And I think what is the most varying and the most problematic is that they do this usually in the name of democracy. And I think that is like why it's usually very hard to speak about Hungary, because it is a new member state. And then like, if you look at the laws, again, this law was enacted as a child protection law. So like, how could you argue with that? Like, of course you want to protect children, and it's like very tricky to criticize it, because if you criticize it, then okay, so are you with pedophiles then? So like, they make it in a way that it's very hard to actually oppose it. And we were just discussing before the call started that actually today is the first day when the European Union said that Hungary is not a democracy anymore. And so I think those kind of things are becoming more and more important. Like, even if it's very hard, it's a very hard moment to be here in this situation as a Hungarian citizen. And it is very obvious that the government is using this as something like to fuel even more hatred towards the European Union in Hungary. But I think it's very important to say, like, these kind of laws are undemocratic, and it is against international human rights standards.
I want to. There are laws that are undemocratic. What happens? I mean, everybody here has touched on different points, but what isn't working? What are the sort of parts of a democracy that should function that are not, that allow this to happen? And I guess I meant to press you on this, Alok, and then got anxious about time. How is it possible that a section of the Section 66A of the IT Act was struck down 7 years ago and is still being used to put people in jail?
Yeah.
And what are the institutions? What has happened that that people's lives can be ruined, so pulled apart on the basis of a law that shouldn't even be that's not on the books anymore?
In one sense, it is it's the result of something that I mentioned, right? You have the police and the judiciary, which have really, I would say, fallen apart, but have really lost sight of their mission and their goal. Now, police, you could argue, and this goes back a little bit further in our history, India's police were meant to be a colonial police force. Your job is to keep the people quiet for the rulers. We never fundamentally reformed the police in India, right? The leadership may have changed, some of the laws may have changed, but if you go back and look at the way the police is structured, down to the uniforms that they wear the same khaki brown uniforms that the British used to wear in India. And it tells you and it conveys visually the idea that the police are here to keep you quiet, to keep the peace at most, but for the rulers, which means that intuitively the police take their cue from the rulers. They take their cue from this is what we are supposed to and not supposed to do. And the agency which holds the police accountable, the judiciary, uh, we have not been able to inculcate that spirit of independence in the judiciary. Now, a lot of the discussion of independence of judiciary in India focuses at the higher levels, right? We like to talk about our Supreme Court judges and our High Court judges and look at their judgments and saying, are they doing a good job or a bad job? But there is a fundamental right in India which guarantees that that within 24 hours of your arrest, you are required to be produced before a magistrate. Right? A magistrate is a judicial authority. This is the first time you get your day in court, which is within 24 hours of being arrested. Unfortunately, a lot of magistrates seem to think that this is an administrative exercise. Okay, person has been arrested, they have turned up. How many days do you want me to keep it? It's never a why should I keep this person in police custody? It's a how many days or how long. If very, very rarely does a police does an accused appear before a magistrate and the magistrate says, yeah, there's no reason to arrest this person. This is not an offense. Please let this person go. And somehow, and this is something that needs perhaps more investigation. I think we've lost Larry, but I think I'll continue what I'm saying. Uh, this perhaps needs some more investigation. But how did magistrates stop seeing their work as holding the police accountable? When did they when did they continue to believe that their job is to make the police's life easier, not the citizens' life easier? So it speaks to a state of rule of law in this country where the institutions are not taking their cue from what the law says, but who is saying what they need to do. So, and I think that is the serious problem. The fact that you don't take the rights of citizens seriously, you don't take the requirement of the rule of law seriously at the level of the police and the judiciary. Don't forget about the big government or I'm 100% sure that if police did their jobs as the law required, and if the magistrates did their job as the law required, we'd be having a very different discussion today.
Indeed. Let us, in the interest of time, I'd like us to talk about the big tech companies, which I know, is a prominent focus for all of us in different parts of our work and research. And they're, as everyone has mentioned, and I was acknowledging before, these laws that that either limit different types of speech or require different kinds of collection of people's data, although they're passed by a government, ultimately a lot of the enforcement and where the the sort of concrete action takes place is in spaces that are owned and governed by Meta or by Google, or other big companies. So and this is open to anybody. What role do these companies play here? And are there, when you look at whether it's 69A in India or the fake news bill in Brazil or this relatively new law in Hungary. What do you think the tech companies should do or could do to, to sort of be a kind of last layer that people using their services might be able to rely on for some amount of transparency or some pushback against overly broad demands?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and
Great.
then leave it to the others. I think in Brazil now it's very clear that the fake news bill did not pass much due to the pressure that big tech companies exerted upon Congress members and just this public campaign that they moved trying to tell people that this bill will not look at fake news. Look, Google ran some ads that said, and Meta too, about Facebook, that said something like, you small entrepreneur, sorry, this word is very hard for me, you are going to be harmed by this bill because targeted ads won't work anymore, something like that. So they played to very individual pressure points in a country where the economy is at a very bad state. We have growing informality, so people are becoming entrepreneurs not because they have the option. So they knew which pressure points to push. And in relation to Congress members, I think this speaks to a problem which has been improving over the past years, which is our Congress members understand very little about social media. So I think I always think about the example when Mark Zuckerberg was questioned by the US Senate and someone asked him, oh, but how do you make money? Like, do you charge for, do you charge users? And last year in Brazil, we saw some, well, he wasn't questioned, but we saw some senators send similar questions to platforms in the context of the parliamentary commission that was investigating the pandemic handling in Brazil. Platforms were called in during that committee. So it speaks to how, because these people who are deciding the rules and who should be setting standards understand very little about how social media works, this means that social media platforms operating in Brazil kind of have the territory to themselves, right? They can do whatever they want. And that's very alarming because Brazil is such a huge market for these platforms, as India is. So losing Brazil or having to change their operations in Brazil would be very problematic for these companies. So of course they're pushing back against regulations. But I think, and I spoke to a person this week who is kind of aware of what big tech companies think of this bill and legislation overall. They understand that they have to come to the table to discuss at some point, right? Because the DMA in Europe is coming, the DSA. So there is this trend that even countries that are not very proactive in pushing legislation will have to enforce some kind of regulation upon platforms. So I think, and it should be interesting in the next year, because if former President Lula is the winner of the election, as polls suggest he will be right now, don't want to confirm, but that's kind of the scenario. He has promised to regulate platforms. And we know that the type of regulation he thinks about is very different from what the right thinks and what Bolsonaro wishes. So next year should be interesting for regulation, platform regulation in Brazil. But I hope that instead of, and I wrote this when we talked previously, that instead of lobbying in the background or just trying to convince senators and representatives based on very personal interests, big tech companies come to the table and actually discuss and take part in the debate. Because we also need society to be more informed of what is at stake. And if they're in the background and just, like under the covers, like doing their thing, we don't inform in the end. So I think, we need to qualify the debate better in Brazil about platform regulation.
If I can just go right after Lice, because India has had the exact opposite situation. We had a data protection law, which I will be fair and say it had a lot of problems. We as an organization had helped draft some of it, and then it underwent changes, and those changes were problematic. I will not say it was a perfect law, but it was an effort to try and reduce the power of big tech. And big tech lobbied, and got the bill entirely withdrawn. So, and a 5 year effort to try and draft a first of its kind data protection law in India essentially fell apart because of the lobbying of big tech companies. So, I come from a place of skepticism. Also, perhaps because of the countries here, India was perhaps only one colonized by a company, the East India Company, before the British government took over. Uh, I am aware of the powers of a company. They may not today have an army, but in my view, I think the likes of a Facebook or a Google or a Meta or an Alphabet or whatever you want to call it uh, is perhaps comparable to most countries. I don't think beyond 5 or 6 countries, I include the EU as one country for the moment, not too many countries can really rein in the power of a Meta or an Alphabet uh, in the work that they do, or even Amazon for that matter. And I would be very, very wary of any efforts of relying on or expecting big tech companies to push back against the government. Uh, we know for a fact, and this has been revealed by the Facebook whistleblower, that Facebook went light on the ruling party's election campaigns. They allowed them to get past a lot of their regulations, gave them a lot of hidden advantages, and maybe didn't contribute too much to their win. But we saw how they were clearly favoring one party over the other, and we only found out because the whistleblower said so. That said, uh, I will still say that perhaps there may be space for them to push back, but they have to push back in public, open fora. So recently, Twitter has filed a challenge against the government using its power under Section 69A, which I mentioned earlier, to take down certain content. And Twitter's concern perhaps has been that the government has perhaps gone too far this time. The union government, they've asked to take down otherwise unexceptionable political content, which they feel will really affect you know free discourse on the platform. So I would be deeply skeptical of big tech being on the same side as most citizens in matters of free speech. But if they do it should be something that we can see publicly, not quiet lobbying or putting the right words in the right ears, but something that all of us can see and know, okay, we trust that you're on our side because you're willing to go and say this in public.
I was going to cite that Twitter move as well, because I think that is like it is very unique to take such an activist approach from a big tech company. But it is also true, and I think that's something I should mention about Hungary, that like in Hungary, the government kind of recognized that like they centralized the traditional media massively, so they control traditional media, but they realize that is not really the main channel people get the news from anymore. So they kind of tried to implement that type of centralization on social media with a network of influencers. And I think social media companies need to understand that they are being critical infrastructure in the hands of authoritarian governments, and they are in a position to actually counter argue in a lot of situations. And Twitter did that, and they probably understand like how important they are for politicians in India. So I think that is like where a very important step. And I would say, like in a lot of situations, what Alok was saying, that is very important to be transparent. Like even if you end up not pushing back and you do comply with the government demand, I think you can still say that you disagree with this, and that is also like something, and that is something I would expect from Netflix in case of Hungary as well, or in case of Saudi Arabia, where it is censoring content because it is not compatible with Islamic values.
If I can just jump in. Yeah, I think that's very interesting because in Brazil, like we see this very, we see distinct stances from platforms, because right now, since we don't have a fake news bill or a bill that regulates content takedown or remove or even account suspensions, everything goes to the judiciary system. And that is insane because it's such an overloaded system already. And even small things such as you're a small businessman and your store account was taken down for a reason you don't know. in order to really obtain information on why it was taken down, they have to go to a court and ask for information. It's such a huge process and kind of stupid in the end. But at the same time, I know that, and I have to give it to platforms here, that in Brazil, they tend to push back against either data requests or takedown removal or takedown and removal requests from governments and even authorities. So sometimes they will do it because they are enforced by a huge fine if they don't do it, but then they will publicly say, we complied, but we don't agree. Or we complied, but we are fighting back in courts, like we will appeal this decision and everything. So I think in the end, it's kind of, it shows that they have this position where they are always defending their freedom and their freedom to operate in the country, right? And I see that now when Vesna said that they have to be aware that they are being used by authoritarian governments, I think platforms in Brazil, based on also the example of Donald Trump, they are very aware that they might be used for a very problematic purpose now in the election. So the big question we ask ourselves as journalists right now is whether platforms will take down Bolsonaro if he goes out and says that the election was frauded. What will they do? So I think it's a very delicate position, but I wish they were more transparent, because we're always asking, as journalists, we're always asking. And I know that like the public prosecutor in Brazil is also asking, but they don't answer. So we have to keep guessing. And that comes from the small businessman who has his account taken down to us journalists who are covering the issue. So yeah, as always, transparency is the way to go. And I think that we always repeat that, but it really is, right?
And it is actually an area in which you see legislators and, you know, all kinds of policymakers from very different political perspectives often can align on that. So I do think that I'm just shove my own opinion in, but listening to what you all are saying, it's, you know, whether it's like Lice, you were just saying the administrative just challenge and the amount of time it can take as a regular citizen to just find out, why did my channel get taken down? Whether it's that, or it's a real, you know, sort of a real political reason, some of the things that you alluded to, Alok, that leaves people really in the dark about what has happened to whatever kind of speech they're trying to post, or whatever else it is they're doing online that's been taken down under 69A, for instance, that the technology companies could make a difference in that dynamic simply by really institutionalizing transparency at a level that would allow individuals to get information about what's happening to my speech, what's happening to my online materials. We are nearly at time. And I would like to ask, if, as a sort of a final, really probably challenging and annoying question, if there is a little bit of, if we can find some light or optimism looking ahead from here, where do we find it? What do we work towards, push, promote, strategize around? Because we're in a really difficult time. I think of, you know, from 2015 onwards, it's been tough and messy, and things always seem to get worse when it seemed like they couldn't. So how do we move forward?
I think in case of Hungary, it's been so tiring to go to demonstrations and show solidarity to people. It's just like, it's been a never-ending demonstration ever since I moved to the capital for me. But I think you just have to continue doing that. I think you just have to raise your voice. You have to say that you disagree with things and not remain silent. I think it's a very big cliche, but what Alok was saying about Nazis, I think a lot of people remain silent during those times, and I think that is what we need to make sure that we like have these conversations and express disagreement.
Yeah, I'm not very optimistic at the moment. 20 days out from elections, like, yeah, I'm just very worried about democracy in Brazil. And even, yeah, if we are able to retain democracy, how will we move forward? But I think, yeah, thinking of my role as a journalist and researcher, I think it's all about educating people of what is at stake. That's kind of what I can do, and educating myself. And also, I think it's challenging to try to see everything as, you know, a non-binary thing. It's not good or bad. Like the area in between is so filled with details, and I think we have to focus on what is in between. Always thinking of fundamental rights and everything, but I try now to see platforms less not as villains, but as, look, they are a crucial part of our democracy. So how can we work from here on? But yeah, I'll keep doing my job. Not very optimistic words, sorry.
It's okay. So stay engaged, educate, and Alok, take the final word.
Okay, it's a difficult one, but so this is I think what doesn't tend to feature in a lot of conversations. You said educate. You said I think organize. Let me add a third word to it, which is build. I think this is where a lot of conversations look at what's broken and perhaps don't look at what can be built. And we don't need to assume that to build something we'll need vast resources that a Google or a Facebook can mobilize. That perhaps what we need to build is something more small scale that can be replicated and can scale up. And by build, I mean, can we build a better police? Can we build a better judiciary? Can we build better local government? Because this to me has been the biggest learning, and a lot of work that I do is with different levels of government here in India. I find that it's almost as if like walking in three parallel worlds. What occupies the minds of the local government, the state government, and the union government. Uh, and I think we have a very top-down idea of government that what happens in the top comes down. It actually goes the other way up. So perhaps what we need to do is build better and build back and build for the future. So if I'll leave that slightly optimistic note here. I don't know exactly how it will be done, but I know the way forward is by building things better.
Well, I think you all did really well on that question, all things considered. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation that I know we could continue for probably years to come, but we must conclude here for now. So I wish everyone a safe and healthy International Democracy Day. If you don't already, and this is to all of our viewers right now and who might watch this later on, be sure to visit globalvoices.org, read our stories from around the world in more than 20 languages, and sign up to receive our daily and weekly newsletters. And if you don't already, please be sure to follow us on Twitter at Global Voices, on Instagram at Global Voices Online, and subscribe to our updates on our Facebook and YouTube pages. Thank you again to everyone who joined us today, and we will see you next time on Global Voices Insights.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. My pleasure.
Thanks.